Good morning, Ma'am Medrano and classmates. This is my report about the concluding remarks on the second part of inquiry, the origin development of linguistic theory in Western studies of language of Ferdinand de Saussure by Ernst Friedrich Conrad. First part of inquiry, Saussure linguistic principles. Saussure was in no way directly influenced by any of the concepts, principles, or theories outside linguistics proper. Distinction between Lang and parole and his frequent reference to the social nature of language, its development and functioning, has been regarded as a clear indication of Durkheim's and Tard's influence on him. In dealing with admitting an indirect influence of Durkheim ideas of Saussure through the intermediary of Meillet is quite likely. His ideas about Lang, parole, and language only after he had been exposed to the current work in sociology, but indicates that sociological principles played an important part in shaping the intellectual paradigm of the late 19th and the early 20th century. First part of inquiry. In the case of Saussure's distinction between historical and non-historical treatments of language, it has been able to show similarly striking parallels between Saussure's argument and ideas put forward in works from philosophy and psychology. Example of Whitney's influential works, where Saussure's distinction between associative and syntagmatic relations are concerned. Whitney proposed that language therefore emerge and change naturally, with usage governing the characters of any language, and with words gradually becoming conventionally accepted parts of the language. On the second part of the inquiry, on the first chapter, Saussure realized the necessity for distinguishing between language as first, a code agreed upon by a given speech community, the Lang and parole, and second, the underlying system which permits each individual member to speak and to understand the language. On the other hand, with the individual speech act not necessarily susceptible to systematic analysis on the other. Second chapter. All these findings have by no means been brought forward in an attempt to minimize Saussure's accomplishments. Prime concern was to delineate some of the ideas which were in the air during Saussure's lifetime, in order to provide a more adequate basis for a well-judged appreciation of his proposal, which may in fact be regarded as revolutionary. That is his paradigm creating. Third and last chapter, post-Saussurean development. Most influential components of Saussurean theory. First, the synchrony and diachrony distinction. Second, the Lang and parole dichotomy. Third, the theory of the language sense. And last, the reports syntagmatic and associative. His influence has been largely through a given set of terms which have been interpreted differently by linguists, rather than by a complete acceptance of his theory by a given group of scholars. The general conclusion of the study. For a number of reasons, both political and cultural, Saussure's ideas did not become the general property of linguistic scholarship until the late 1950s, and even then they were discussed as a more or less complete theory by only a comparatively small number of linguists. Second, the majority of those linguists who eventually did venture to analyze Saussurean views contented themselves with either pointing to inaccuracies or apparent contradictions in the course, and tended to discredit Saussure's suggestion as a whole by concentrating their critique on a particular ingredient they disliked or could not accept. Methodological procedures have frequently been mistaken for theory, and some scholars have deluded themselves into mistaking the attainment of a higher level of abstraction for purely theoretical work. Last, adventurers of stature Louis Hemslop, who prided themselves on their truly Saussurean approach to language, must be criticized for having failed to discuss important parts of the theory propounded in the course. They too adopted those aspects which they found attractive and in accordance with their own preconceived ideas, and discarded, often without appropriate discussion, many other ingredients of Saussurean theory. Second part of investigation. Delayed victory, the course encountered the following facts remain. Lectures on general linguistics, the promise inherent in the ideas laid down in the course has not yet been fulfilled. Many of the suggestions put forward by Saussure have not yet been adequately exploited, reinterpreted, and developed to conform with present state of knowledge. Saussure's theory has not been taken as a whole, but instead only certain aspects, usually in complete disregard of their particular context, had been exploited, which is poor science. The course being regarded more as a query where anyone may pick up the stone which he thinks fit for his own edifice, than as an overall theory of language which has to be comprehended as a unity. Third, many linguists do not appear to have realized yet that it is the awareness of one's theoretical framework and the recognition by the linguist of the precedence of theory over and above the engagement in the practical study of language, which permit linguistics to be rightfully called a science. That it is the obligation of the scientist to engage in what Kohn has termed mopping up operations, in working out the theoretical framework in which Saussure outlined. Fourth, present linguistic work suggests an increase of interest and inattention to the theoretical aspect of language study, and there are some indications that important components of Saussure's theory are now being tackled again, but with more theoretical rigor and a deeper understanding of the course as a whole. Saussure's course and the state of linguistic science. First of all, the theory of language and the history of linguistics are both concerned with the result of reflection on human speech, the main distinction being that the former adopts the synchronic and the latter the diachronic viewpoint. Secondly, the theorist of today, though he may delude himself that he is starting from egg, when he proposes a certain principle or theorem, cannot divest himself totally from either the intellectual environments of his own time in general, or the culturally transmitted ideas about language in particular. It is necessary to have read the so-called histories of linguistics to have knowledge of previous opinions about language, our upbringing, cultural heritage, and to a certain extent the society surrounding us inculcate us with many ideas which we eventually tend to consider as the result of our own creative capacities. Thirdly, the history of linguistics can only be adequately presented to those who engage or who have previously engaged in the activities of normal science. Philosophically minded enthusiasts who have recognized that the history of linguistics may well represent the history of ideas par excellence may do more harm than good to this field of scholarly activity, unless he has received a formal training in linguistics in general. Finally, linguistics, and we wish to point to its theoretical aspect in particular, cannot be rightfully regarded as a mature science unless it has established a link with and a general awareness of its past. The result of our investigations. No evidences that there has been any direct influence by Durkheim, Comte, or Tarde, or any other sociologist on Saussure. However, there are two major sources through which Saussure became acquainted with sociological notions. First, Whitney's emphasis on the social nature of language, his distinction between the individual and the community in his attempt to explain linguistic change. Maylay's programmatic article in 1906, in which he made use of Durkheimian ideas for the definition of language. Second, similar observation had been made concerning other extra-linguistic influences, although in the case of political economy, no found any linguistic publication of the time in which the notion of value, for instance, had been anticipated, the comparison of language with money or words with pieces of money. Other extra-linguistic influences on Saussure, in particular psychological notions, can be traced back to linguistic writings of Saussure's own time, especially to the work of H. Paul, who for his part adopted Herbartian psychology, and Group6, who made use of psychology of Bain, James, and earlier British associationists, apart from Baylor and term from economy. Other terms such as zero and term were derived from mathematics. And that's all for today. Thank you for listening.